How
Go
could you just
ahead,
walk away
I
after
said,
everything we've
stepping
been
back
through?
as the steel
This isn't about
cable
walking
tightened
away, it's
around
about
my
what's
boat.
right.
Make sure you get a
Right?
good grip on
You
it.
think this is
The
right?
winch screamed to life, a high-pitched metallic whine that cut through the stillness of the marina, and I could smell the sharp mix of salt water and diesel
I
fumes
expect
hanging
this area
heavy in the
cleared by
early morning air
1600
as the
hours.
hull of my
Sharp.
32
No
foot center
exceptions, no
console
excuses.
shifted
The
inches
rules
at
are
a
posted
time,
clearly right
dragged
there.
like it didn't
I
belong
need
there,
these
like
yachts
it
moved
wasn't
to the
anchored in
south
a place
mooring
I knew down
immediately.
to every
We don't
weathered
have all
plank
day,
and
so get it
rusted
done
bolt.
now.
The water slapped softly against the
Secure
docks,
this one,
calm
then move
and
down to
different,
the next
while
piling.
chaos unfolded right in front of me.
I want
Linda
one
Graves
every 10
stood 10
feet.
feet away on the pier, heels clicking against the wood, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of authority she hadn't earned. Her lips curled into that
Ensure
practiced
everyone
smile
receives
that
a notice
always felt
today.
more
What are you
like a
calling us?
warning than anything
What
friendly.
right do you have?
Unauthorized
We understand,
vessel,
but this is
she
company
said,
policy now.
loud enough for the small crowd of early risers to hear. Her voice smooth and certain, like she'd already won something that wasn't hers to claim. Behind her,
This
two
is the
tow
critical
operators
juncture,
worked
right here,
efficiently,
within the 12-mile
eyes
limit.
down,
Agreed.
just
But
doing their
according to these
job,
filings,
hooking my
their
boat
vessel
like it was
already in
any other
international
violation
waters.
on a list,
We need to
like they
proceed as
hadn't just
planned.
crossed a
I'm
line that
authorizing the
couldn't be
payment now.
uncrossed.
Ensure the
I
crew
didn't
is ready
argue.
to depart
I
by
didn't shout.
1600 hours.
I didn't even move closer. I just watched.
I'm afraid we have
Because
to
what
halt
she didn't
operations
know,
immediately,
what none
sir.
of them knew, was that
On what
this wasn't
grounds?
just a boat,
We are
and
fully
this wasn't
compliant
just
with
some HOA
regulations.
power play gone too
Your
far.
permit ends
The
here.
rope creaked,
This
the
entire
metal
section is
groaned,
outside our
and my boat
jurisdiction.
finally broke
Then
free
everything
from
we
the
planned
slip,
is irrelevant.
drifting awkwardly as it was pulled toward the waiting truck, leaving behind a faint ripple that spread across the water like a quiet signal that something irreversible had just begun. Linda glanced at me, expecting anger, maybe a scene, maybe the kind of reaction she could write up in another report, but all she got was silence, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anything. You'll receive the citation and storage fees by the end of the day, she added, flipping a page on her clipboard, already moving on, already treating this like a routine enforcement, like she hadn't just made the biggest mistake of her career. I could feel the rough grain of the dock under my boots, the faint vibration traveling up through the wood as the truck engine revved, and for a second, it would have been easy, too easy, to step in, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. I let them take it. I let her believe she was in control. Because sometimes the fastest way to win isn't to fight back right away. It's to let the other side go just far enough that there's no way out when the truth finally catches up to them. And as the truck pulled away with my boat in tow, disappearing past the marina entrance like it owned the place, I realized something almost funny about the whole situation. Linda Graves hadn't just ordered the wrong boat to be towed. She'd just picked a fight on ground she didn't even realize I owned. And by the time she figured that out, it was already going to be too late. I stood there long after the sound of the tow truck faded, listening to the gentle creak of the empty slip where my boat had been just minutes ago, the rope still swaying slightly like it had not yet accepted what just happened. And for a moment the marina felt different, quieter in a way that pressed against your ears, like the place itself knew something was off. The air carried that familiar mix of salt and engine oil that I had grown up with, a scent that never really leaves you once it gets into your bones, and I took a slow breath, letting it settle me instead of push me into reacting too soon. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and everything you just saw play out happened on water that my family has controlled for 3 generations, even if people like Linda Graves prefer to pretend otherwise. My grandfather built this marina back in 1962 with nothing but a small loan and a stubborn refusal to let anyone tell him where he could or could not dock his own boat. And my father expanded it slip by slip, piling in long days under the sun, hands blistered, boots soaked, turning a stretch of neglected coastline into something that kept this entire area alive. I grew up running along these docks before I could even swim properly, counting cleats, memorizing every inch of shoreline, learning early that water has rules that people either respect or pay for ignoring. When my father passed, he did not leave me a speech or a letter, just a set of keys and a stack of documents that spelled out one simple truth. This place is yours, and it is your responsibility to protect it, not just for yourself, but for everyone who depends on it. That responsibility is not something you wave around like a badge. It is something you carry quietly, which is exactly why I did not step in when Linda decided to make her move. See, people like her look at a marina and see property lines they think they understand. They see docks and slips and assume it all fits neatly into whatever jurisdiction they claim on paper. But water does not work like that, and neither do the rights tied to it. Over the past few months, I had watched the way she operated, the way she expanded her influence inch by inch, sending out notices, enforcing rules that seemed small on their own but added up to something much bigger, something calculated. It started with minor things, warnings about dock aesthetics, then complaints about boat sizes, then sudden new guidelines about what could and could not be considered compliant within what she called the extended community boundary. Most people paid the fines just to avoid the headache, and that is exactly how she built her confidence, one quiet victory at a time, until she believed there was no one left who would push back. I remember the first time she walked these docks with that same clipboard, heels clicking like she was inspecting something she owned, and even then I noticed the way she spoke about the marina, not as something separate from her authority, but as something she was slowly absorbing into it. That was the moment I realized this was not going to be a simple disagreement over rules. This was going to turn into something bigger, something that needed to be handled the right way. So I kept my distance. I let her issue her notices. I let her believe that everyone here, including me, was just another name on her list. And when she finally crossed that line this morning, when she ordered my boat to be towed as if it were just another violation to process, I understood exactly why she felt so confident doing it, because from her perspective, there had never been a consequence before. The empty space beside me where my boat had been felt heavier than it should have, like a missing piece in a place that was supposed to be whole, and I could hear the distant hum of the tow truck somewhere beyond the marina entrance, carrying more than just fiberglass and steal away with it. What Linda did not realize was that she had not just taken a boat. She had just put herself on a path that she could not step off from anymore, and the longer she kept moving forward, the harder it was going to hit when everything she thought she controlled started pushing back all at once. I first met Linda Graves on a Tuesday morning that smelled like fresh varnish and overpriced perfume, the kind that lingers just long enough to make you aware someone wants to be noticed before they even speak. And I remember the exact sound her heels made against the dock, sharp, deliberate, like she was announcing authority with every step. She was standing at the end of slip 14, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, holding that same clipboard like it was something official, flipping through pages as if she was reviewing violations in a place she had only recently started visiting. "You must be Ethan," she said without looking up at first, her tone already carrying that quiet assumption that she was in control of the conversation before it even started. And when she finally met my eyes, there was a smile there that never reached them, polished and practiced, the kind you learn when you spend enough time telling people what they can and cannot do. She introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association up the hill, a position she managed to turn into something that sounded a lot closer to a regulatory agency than a neighborhood committee. And within the first minute, she was already explaining new compliance expectations for shared environmental spaces, a phrase that did not exist anywhere in the documents that actually mattered. At the time, I let her talk, because people like Linda always reveal more than they realize when they think no one is challenging them. And she talked about property values, about maintaining standards, about protecting the aesthetic integrity of the community, all while standing on a dock that had been here longer than most of the houses she claimed to represent. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing her more often, always with that clipboard, always measuring something, noting something, sending out letters that began polite and ended with fines. And it was not long before the marina regulars started coming to me with those letters in hand, confusion written all over their faces. Unauthorized dock modifications, non-compliant mooring practices, visual obstructions to waterfront views, phrases that sounded official enough to scare people into compliance, but vague enough to stretch however she needed them to. One of the older boat owners, a man who had been docking here for nearly 20 years, showed me a notice that claimed his boat violated a newly established size restriction, something that had never existed before, and when he asked her where that rule came from, she pointed to a printed addendum that looked recent, clean, almost like it had been created overnight. That was the first time I saw the pattern clearly, not just enforcement, but expansion, each rule building on the last, each notice pushing her authority a little further past where it actually ended. The marina sat just outside the official boundary of her association, something that had been clearly defined decades ago. But boundaries on paper mean very little to someone who believes they can redefine them through persistence alone. She began referring to the marina as part of the extended community zone, a term she repeated often enough that people started to question whether it had always been that way. And that is how it works, not by force, but by repetition until doubt replaces certainty. I remember one evening watching her stand at the top of the dock, looking out over the water like she was surveying something she planned to own. And even then there was a moment where I could have stepped in, could have corrected her publicly, could have shut the whole thing down before it grew any further. But I did not, because stopping her too early would have ended it quietly, and quiet endings do not leave room for consequences. So I let her continue. I let her send her letters. I let her build her version of authority piece by piece, because every document she issued, every fee she enforced, every decision she made without the legal ground to stand on was another layer she would eventually have to answer for. And when she stood there this morning, watching my boat being pulled away like she had finally claimed something significant, I could see it in the way she held herself, the certainty, the satisfaction, the belief that she had reached the point where no one could challenge her anymore. What she did not understand was that the more confident she became, the less careful she was, and that confidence was exactly what led her to make the one move she could not undo. Because ordering that tow was not just another step in her process. It was the moment she crossed from pushing boundaries into breaking something that was never hers to touch. And now the question was not whether she would realize it, but how long it would take before everything she built started to come apart. The first official notice showed up before the sun had fully burned through the morning haze, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve and zip-tied to the post right where my boat had been. The paper still slightly damp from the ocean air, edges curling just enough to make it feel like it had been there longer than it actually had. And the bold heading at the top read, Violation Notice, Unauthorized Vessel Removal and Storage Assessment. Like it was something routine, something ordinary, something I was supposed to accept without question. I pulled it free, the plastic crinkling under my fingers, and read through the language slowly, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to see exactly how far she had gone this time. There it was in clean, confident print. A breakdown of fees already accumulating by the hour, storage charges at a private lot, administrative processing costs, enforcement penalties, each line item stacking on top of the last like. She had built this system long before she ever tested it on me. The smell of ink and salt mixed together in the air, and I could hear the distant hum of boat engines starting up around the marina, life continuing like nothing had changed, even though something very real had just shifted under the surface. By mid-morning, I had 3 different dock owners walk up to me holding identical notices, their faces tight with confusion and frustration, asking the same question in different ways. How could she do this? Where did these rules come from? What were they supposed to do now? One of them, a guy named Carl who had been keeping his fishing boat here since before I took over operations, shook his head and said he had already called the number listed on the notice, and whoever answered had told him the charges would continue until full compliance was met, no exceptions. That was when it clicked for me, not just what she had done, but how she had structured it, because this was not a one-time overreach. This was a system designed to pressure people into paying before they had time to question it. I folded the notice once, then again, feeling the thickness of the paper between my fingers, and looked out over the water where my boat used to sit. The empty slip now drawing more attention than anything else on the dock, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Around noon, I decided to take a drive, following the same route the tow truck would have taken out of the marina, past the entrance road, and up toward the main highway, the tires of my truck crunching over gravel as I traced the path step by step, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. It did not take long to find the lot. A fenced-off section behind a commercial building about 2 miles inland, the kind of place you would never notice unless you were looking for it. And there it was, my boat sitting among a row of others, tagged, numbered, reduced to an inventory item in someone else's operation. I parked across the street and watched for a minute, the heat from the pavement rising in waves, the faint smell of asphalt mixing with the salt that still clung to the hull, and I could see a small office near the gate where paperwork was being processed, another layer in the system she had built. I could have walked in right then, demanded answers, demanded release, forced a confrontation that would have made everything public immediately, but that would have ended it too quickly and too cleanly. Instead, I stayed where I was, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of what she had done extend just a little further, Because every hour my boat sat there under her authority, every dollar added to that fabricated bill, every notice sent out to other owners was another piece of evidence stacking up in a way she clearly had not anticipated. As I drove back toward the marina, the sun now high enough to cast sharp reflections across the water, I realized something that made the whole situation shift again, because this was no longer just about one boat or one decision. This had become a pattern, and patterns are what turns small violations into something much harder to explain away. By the time I pulled back into my usual spot and stepped out onto the dock, the air felt heavier, not because of what I had lost, but because of what she had just set in motion, and the question was no longer whether this would escalate, but how far she was willing to take it before she realized there was no way back. By late afternoon, the second wave hit, not louder, not more aggressive, but quieter in a way that felt more deliberate, like someone tightening a net one thread at a time instead of throwing it all at once. And it came in the form of an official letter delivered by certified mail, thick paper, embossed header, the kind of presentation designed to make you hesitate before even opening it. I stood at the edge of the dock with the envelope in my hand, feeling the faint texture of the raised lettering under my thumb while the wind carried the steady rhythm of water against the pilings. And for a moment, I just looked at it, already knowing it was not going to be simple. Inside was a formal demand, not just for payment, but for acknowledgement, language carefully structured to make it sound like I had already agreed to their authority, like the situation had already been decided, and all that was left was for me to comply. The total amount listed had nearly doubled since the morning, line after line of additional charges stacked on top of the original notice, administrative review fees, compliance enforcement surcharges, extended storage penalties, each one more questionable than the last, but written with just enough confidence to make someone second-guess their own position. At the bottom, there was a deadline, 72 hours to resolve the balance in full or face further action, including what they described as permanent revocation of docking privileges within the community's managed waters. I actually let out a quiet breath at that part, not out of anger, but because it told me something important, something I had been waiting to see. They were not just claiming authority over the marina anymore. They were now putting it in writing, expanding their reach in a way that could be measured, documented, and eventually challenged in a way that mattered. Still, I did not respond. That was the part that felt wrong even to me for a second, standing there with every instinct telling me to shut it down, to make a call, to pull out the documents my father left me, and end this entire thing before it got any further. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, letting it rest in my hand like something heavier than paper should be. About an hour later, I found myself sitting across from a local attorney I had worked with once before on a zoning issue, his office smelling faintly of coffee and old files, the kind of place where time seems to move slower because everything is measured in paperwork instead of minutes. I laid the notice out on his desk and watched his expression as he read through it, his brow tightening slightly with each paragraph. And when he finally looked up at me, there was a pause before he spoke that told me more than his words did. If this were inside their jurisdiction, he said carefully, tapping the page with his finger, they could argue enforcement authority, at least temporarily. That word hung there for a second, temporarily, just enough to create doubt where there had not been any before. He leaned back in his chair and continued, explaining how disputes like this can drag on, how challenging them immediately can sometimes complicate things, how paying under protest is often the faster way to regain control while sorting out the legal side later. I listened, nodding, letting his words settle even though part of me already knew where this was going. For a brief moment, it almost sounded reasonable. Pay the fees, recover the boat, deal with the rest afterward. That was the first time the situation actually felt like it could slip out of my control, not because she was right, but because the system she built was designed to make people choose convenience over confrontation. I could feel that pull, that quiet pressure to just end it, to stop the escalation before it got any worse. But something about the way the letter was written, the confidence in it, the assumption that I would fold the same way others had, made it clear that stopping now would not fix anything. It would just validate everything she had been building. When I left his office, the sun was already starting to drop, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and the air carried that late-day warmth that always fades faster than you expect near the water. I sat in my truck for a minute before starting the engine, the envelope resting on the seat beside me, and I realized that what looked like a loss on paper was actually something else entirely, something she had just handed me without realizing it. Because every demand, every added fee, every written claim of authority was no longer just a conversation or a misunderstanding, it was documented intent. And the more she pushed it, the harder it was going to be for her to explain when someone finally asked her to prove where that authority actually came from. The next morning did not explode into chaos the way most people would expect after something like this. It settled into something quieter and far more calculated, like pressure building under the surface where you cannot see it, but you can feel it if you pay attention, and the first thing I noticed when I stepped onto the dock was not the empty slip anymore, it was the new signs. Fresh, bright, and placed at every entrance point to the marina. Laminated notices fixed to posts and railings with heavy-duty ties. Each one stamped with the same language I had seen on the letters: HOA Managed Waterfront Zone, Compliance Required, printed in bold letters that looked official enough to stop anyone in their tracks. The plastic edges snapped softly in the breeze, tapping against the wood in a steady rhythm that felt almost intentional, like a reminder that something had changed overnight. I walked past the first sign slowly, running my fingers along the edge, feeling the cheap lamination ripple slightly under pressure. And I could not help but notice how quickly she had moved, how efficiently this had been rolled out, like she had been waiting for a moment like this to justify pushing everything forward at once. By mid-morning, the effect was already spreading. Boat owners who had been here for years were hesitating before stepping onto their own docks, glancing at those signs like they meant something more than they actually did, and that hesitation was exactly what she needed. I overheard two people near the fuel station talking in low voices, one of them saying he had already paid part of his fees just to avoid further trouble, while the other was considering pulling his boat out entirely, not because he believed the rules were valid, but because he did not want to deal with the consequences if they were. That was when it became clear just how far this had gone, because it was no longer about enforcement, it was about control, and control does not require everyone to agree, it only requires enough people to comply. Around noon, Linda showed up again, this time not alone, flanked by two men in polos with company logos I did not recognize, both carrying tablets and walking the docks like they were conducting an official survey, stopping at slips, taking photos, tagging boats, building something that looked a lot like a database in real time. She moved with a kind of confidence that only comes from believing there is no one left to challenge you, greeting people by name, explaining new guidelines, issuing instructions like she had been doing this for years instead of weeks. When she reached the center of the marina, she stopped, turned slightly, and for just a second her eyes landed on me. And there was something different in that look, not hesitation, not doubt, but expectation, like she was waiting for me to finally react, to step forward and push back so she could deal with it directly. I did not give her that. Instead, I nodded once, calm, almost indifferent, and turned away, letting her continue uninterrupted, because the last thing I needed was a confrontation that would slow her down. The more she expanded, the more she documented, the more she enforced, the deeper she was stepping into something she clearly did not understand. By early afternoon, another notice hit, this time posted at the marina office door, announcing that any vessel currently in violation could be subject to immediate removal without further warning, effective immediately, a line that carried a weight it did not actually have, but sounded strong enough to make people believe it did. I stood there reading it while the sun reflected off the water in sharp flashes that made it hard to focus for more than a few seconds at a time, and I could feel the tension building around me, not just in the air, but in the way people moved, the way conversations stopped when she walked by, the way uncertainty had started to replace the routine that had defined this place for decades. For a brief moment, I understood exactly why people give into something like this, because it feels easier to comply than to question, easier to pay than to fight, especially when the system pushing against you looks organized, confident, and official. And that was the illusion she had built so carefully, one that only works as long as no one pulls it apart piece by piece. As I walked back toward the empty slip, the sound of those laminated signs tapping in the wind followed me, steady, repetitive, almost like a countdown, and I realized that she had just crossed another line without even realizing it. Because this was no longer just a series of isolated actions, This was now a coordinated operation, documented, visible, and expanding in a way that could not be explained away as a misunderstanding. And the more she added to it, the more difficult it was going to be for her to step back when the moment finally came where she had to answer for all of it. That night, I did not go home right away. Even though the marina had quieted down to that low, steady rhythm it always settles into after sunset. Engines cut off, ropes creaking softly against cleats, water brushing against the hulls in slow, deliberate patterns that almost sound like breathing if you stand still long enough. Instead, I walked into the office and pulled out a set of keys that had not left that drawer in years, the old brass kind with worn edges that carry more history than they look like they should, and I unlocked a cabinet in the back where my father used to keep everything he never wanted to risk losing. The air inside was different, cooler, carrying that faint scent of paper and salt that builds up over decades when documents sit untouched, and I could hear the quiet hum of the overhead light as I slid open the drawer and started going through the files one by one. Most of it I already knew: deeds, permits, maintenance logs, records that had been passed down more as responsibility than as information. But I was not looking for the obvious this time. I was looking for something specific, something that explained why Linda had moved the way she did, why she seemed so certain she could stretch her authority past the point where it should have stopped. It took longer than I expected, the kind of slow, methodical search where every page feels like it might matter until you realize it does not. And for a moment I wondered if I had missed something. If maybe she had found a loophole I had overlooked, something buried in legal language that gave her just enough ground to stand on. Then I found it, not in the main files, but in a secondary folder tucked behind an older set of maps, a survey document dated back to the late 1970s, folded carefully with handwritten notes along the margins that I recognized immediately as my grandfather's. I laid it out on the desk, smoothing the edges flat, and followed the lines with my finger, tracing the boundary markers, the water access points, the coordinates that defined exactly where ownership ended and where jurisdiction changed. It was not complicated once you saw it, but it was precise in a way that left no room for interpretation. The marina, every slip, every dock, every section of water tied to it, sat completely outside the boundaries of the homeowners association, not adjacent, not shared, not overlapping, but separate, defined in a way that had been recorded and reaffirmed multiple times over the years. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under my weight, and let that settle for a second, because this was not just a clarification, this was a fracture in everything she had built. All those notices, all those fees, all those signs she had posted across the marina were based on a claim that did not exist in any document that actually mattered. The quiet in the room felt heavier now, like the space itself understood the shift that had just happened, and I could hear the distant sound of wind moving across the water outside, a low, steady rush that reminded me of something inevitable. For a brief moment, I thought about taking that map, walking straight out onto the dock, and putting an end to everything right there, showing it to her, to everyone, clearing it up in a single conversation that would have left no doubt about where things stood. But that would have stopped it too soon, before it reached the point where it could not be dismissed or minimized. Because right now, what she had done still looked like overreach, like confusion, like something that could be explained away if she needed to. What I had just found turned it into something else entirely, something that would not just raise questions, but demand answers. I folded the document carefully, placing it back in its sleeve, and slid it into a separate folder, one I would not be putting back in that cabinet anytime soon. As I locked the drawer and turned off the light, the darkness settled in around me, and for the first time since this started, everything felt aligned, not resolved, but positioned exactly where it needed to be. Because now I knew for certain that she had not just pushed the boundary, she had stepped completely outside of it, and the further she continued from here, the harder it was going to be for her to ever find her way back. The next morning started slower than the one before, but the tension was still there, sitting just under the surface like something waiting to break, and I could feel it the moment I stepped onto the dock, the air thicker, the conversations quieter, people watching instead of moving like they normally would. I did not head straight for the office this time. I walked the length of the marina instead, taking it all in, every sign still hanging where she had placed it, every laminated notice catching the light just enough to draw attention. and every boat owner moving with that same cautious hesitation that had started creeping in yesterday. But this time, I was not just observing, I was documenting. I had my phone out, not in a way that made it obvious, just enough to capture what mattered. Each sign, each notice, each interaction where her team stopped someone to issue another warning or log another violation. The sound of camera shutters was soft, barely noticeable over the hum of generators and the distant gulls overhead, but every image mattered now. Every detail, building something she could not see yet. Around mid-morning, I made another drive out to the storage lot, the same place where my boat had been taken, but this time I did not stay across the street. I walked up to the gate, slow and calm, the gravel crunching under my boots, and I could smell the heat rising off the asphalt as the sun climbed higher. The office door creaked when I opened it, and a man behind the counter looked up from a stack of forms, his expression shifting just slightly when I gave him the registration number for my boat. He pulled it up without hesitation, reading off the details like it was routine, confirming the intake time, the listed violation, the accumulating fees, and then he said something that caught my attention more than anything else. "We process these directly through the HOA contract," he said, tapping the screen lightly. "They handle authorization, we just store and release." That was the moment everything connected in a way that made the structure clearer, because this was not just her acting alone. This was a system she had extended outward, pulling third parties into something they assumed was legitimate. I asked for a copy of the intake form, and he handed it over without question, a simple document, printed and signed, with her authorization line clearly marked, her name right there in black ink where it should not have been. I folded it carefully, the paper still warm from the printer, and stepped back outside, letting the door close behind me with a dull click that echoed just enough to linger. Back at the marina, I spent the rest of the afternoon pulling records, not just from my own files, but from public access databases, zoning maps, maritime authority guidelines, everything that defined where her authority ended and where actual jurisdiction began. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that there was no gray area here, no overlap she could argue, no interpretation that would support what she had been doing. But what mattered more than the documents themselves was how they connected to everything she had already put in motion, because now I was not just holding proof of ownership, I was building a timeline, a sequence of actions that showed intent, escalation, and enforcement beyond any reasonable boundary. By early evening, I had a stack of copies spread across the office desk, each one tied to something she had done over the past few weeks, each one reinforcing the same point from a different angle, and I could feel the weight of it growing, not just as evidence, but as something that was becoming impossible to ignore. For a moment, I sat there looking at it all, the quiet hum of the marina drifting in through the open window, and I thought again about ending it right there, about walking out with everything in hand and forcing a stop before it went any further. But the pattern was not complete yet, not fully exposed, and without that, it would still leave room for excuses, for explanations, for her to step back and pretend it had all been a misunderstanding. So I let it continue. I let the signs stay up. I let the fees keep building. I let the system she created keep running exactly the way she designed it, because every hour it operated outside its legal boundary was another layer that could not be undone. And as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the docks, I realized that what started as a single decision had now turned into something much bigger, something structured, documented, and growing in a way that she clearly believed was working in her favor. The only question left was how long she would keep pushing before she realized that every step forward was not strengthening her position. It was locking it into place in a way she would not be able to escape once the truth finally surfaced. By the time the pattern became impossible to ignore, it was not just me seeing it anymore. It was everyone, even if they did not fully understand what they were looking at. And that was exactly when I knew it was time to bring in people who did. I made 2 calls that afternoon, both to contacts I had not needed in years, the kind of people you only reach out to when things cross a line from inconvenience into something that carries weight beyond a single complaint. The first was to a maritime attorney out of Galveston, a guy named Robert Hayes who specialized in coastal jurisdiction disputes, someone who understood the difference between what people claim and what the law actually recognizes when it comes to water access and property rights. The second was to a regional representative from the Harbor Authority, Someone whose job it was to make sure that what happens on the water follows a very different set of rules than what happens on land. Neither of them sounded surprised when I started explaining what had been going on, and that alone told me something important. Situations like this were not as rare as people think, but the way Linda had escalated it was. I sent them everything: copies of the notices, photos of the signs, the intake form from the storage lot with her authorization signature, and most importantly, the survey map that clearly defined where her authority stopped. There was a pause on the other end of both calls after they reviewed it. Not long, but just enough to signal that what they were seeing was not something minor. Robert was the first to respond, his voice steady, almost analytical, as he pointed out that issuing fees outside of jurisdiction could be interpreted as more than just overreach, especially when there was a structured system behind it. The harbor authority representative was more direct, stating plainly that any claim of control over those waters without proper designation was not just incorrect, it was actionable. But what mattered more than their reactions was what they both suggested next, and it was the same thing in different words. Do not stop it yet. Let it continue. Let her expand. Let the system run long enough to establish a clear pattern that could not be dismissed as a mistake. That was the moment the strategy fully shifted from defense to something else entirely, something slower, more deliberate, and far more final. Back at the marina, the afternoon played out exactly as it had the day before. More notices, more quiet compliance from people who just wanted the problem to go away, more confidence from Linda as she moved through the docks like she had already secured control over everything she touched. I watched from a distance, the sun reflecting off the water in sharp flashes that made it hard to look directly at anything for too long, and I realized that the dynamic had changed in a way she could not see. From her perspective, nothing had shifted. She was still in control, still enforcing, still expanding, but for mine, every step she took was now being recorded, reviewed, and built into something much larger than a neighborhood dispute. Later that evening, I received a follow-up call from Robert, his tone slightly different this time, more certain, as he explained that if what we had documented continued for even a few more days, it would establish a level of consistency that would be very difficult to defend against. He did not need to say more than that, because the implication was clear. The longer she kept going, the deeper she was stepping into something she would not be able to explain away. I ended the call and stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying that familiar scent of salt and distant fuel, and the marina lights flickering on one by one, casting long reflections across the water. For a moment, everything looked normal again, boats rocking gently, lines tightening and loosening with the tide. But underneath that calm, something had shifted permanently. Because now it was not just about what she had done, it was about what she was continuing to do. And every hour that passed without interruption was not strengthening her position, it was solidifying the case against her in a way that would not leave room for interpretation. And the part she still did not understand was that she was no longer just dealing with a dock owner who could push back. She was now operating in a space where every action she took was being measured against rules she had never bothered to learn. And the moment those rules were enforced, everything she built was going to collapse at once, not gradually, not quietly, but all at the same time. The next day arrived with a kind of quiet that felt heavier than anything that had come before, like the marina itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which direction everything would break. And I could feel it the moment I stepped out onto the dock, the air cooler, sharper, carrying that early morning mix of salt and metal that always lingers before the sun fully takes over. Nothing had slowed down overnight. If anything, Linda had pushed even further, and the first thing I saw was another notice posted at the entrance, this one larger, more detailed, outlining what she now called a final compliance window, a phrase that sounded official enough to make people stop and read twice. The paper snapped lightly in the breeze, and I stood there for a moment, taking in the language, the confidence in it, the assumption that she had already established authority beyond question. Around me, people moved more carefully than usual, conversations quieter, decisions being made in low voices, and I caught pieces of it as I walked past. Someone saying they were going to pay just to avoid escalation, someone else talking about relocating their boat entirely, not because they believed the rules were legitimate, but because they did not want to be caught in something that felt bigger than they could control. That was the second moment where it almost looked like she had already won, not through enforcement, but through pressure, through the slow erosion of resistance that makes people give in before they ever understand what they are giving up. By mid-morning, I received another call from Robert, his tone steady but more direct this time, confirming that everything we had documented was now more than enough to move forward if needed, that the pattern was clear, consistent, and expanding in a way that would be difficult for anyone to defend. He asked me one question before ending the call, simple and precise. Are you ready to stop it, or do you want to let it run a little longer? I stood there with the phone in my hand, looking out over the marina, at the signs, at the notices, at the people adjusting to something they should not have had to adjust to. And for a second, it would have been easy to say yes, to shut it down, to bring everything to a stop before it pushed any further. But I knew that stopping it now would still leave space for interpretation, for her to step back and claim confusion, to reduce everything to a misunderstanding that could be corrected quietly. So I told him to wait. That decision settled into the moment heavier than I expected, because it meant allowing the situation to stretch just a little further, allowing her to continue operating under the belief that she was in control. The rest of the afternoon unfolded exactly the way it had been building toward: more enforcement, more documentation, more confidence on her side, and more quiet compliance from people who just wanted stability back. I watched it all without stepping in, without interrupting, because now every action she took was no longer just part of her system. It was part of something being observed, recorded, and prepared for a response that would not come in pieces. Late in the day, I drove past the storage lot again, not stopping this time, just slowing enough to see my boat still sitting there, tagged, untouched, the fees still accumulating by the hour, and for a brief moment, that pull came back again, the instinct to end it, to get it back, to restore things to the way they were before any of this started. But that instinct faded just as quickly as it came, because I knew that getting it back now would mean losing something much larger, the opportunity to expose everything she had built in a way that could not be ignored. As the sun dropped lower and the marina lights flickered on again, the same quiet settled in, but it felt different this time, more defined, more certain, like the final pieces were falling into place. Because at this point, it was no longer about whether she would stop, it was about how far she would go before someone made her, and the longer she kept pushing, the more complete the outcome would be when that moment finally arrived. And standing there at the edge of the dock, looking out over the water that had never once belonged to her no matter how many signs she posted, I realized that everything she had built was now exactly where it needed to be, not because it was stable, but because it was exposed, fully, completely, and just waiting for the moment when it would all be forced into the light at once. It happened just after 9 a.m., the kind of morning where the sun hits the water just right and everything looks calm enough to make you forget what has been building underneath, and for a few minutes, it almost felt like any other day at the marina until the first unfamiliar vehicle pulled into the lot. It was not loud, not dramatic, just a dark SUV easing into a parking space near the entrance, followed by another one a few seconds later, and then a third, each one parking with the same quiet precision that stood out against the usual rhythm of trucks and trailers. I was standing near the fuel dock when I noticed the shift, the subtle way conversation slowed, the way people started glancing toward the entrance without fully turning their heads, sensing that something was different before they could see it clearly. The doors opened almost in sync, and a small group stepped out, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, carrying folders, wearing that unmistakable look of people who were not there to ask questions, but to confirm answers they already had. From where I stood, I could hear the faint crunch of gravel under their shoes as they walked toward the main dock, the sound steady, controlled, and for a moment, no one said anything, not even Linda, who was halfway through explaining a compliance issue to one of the boat owners when she noticed them approaching. Her voice paused mid-sentence, just for a fraction of a second, before she adjusted, straightened slightly, and shifted into that same confident tone she had been using all week. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile returning quickly, controlled, practiced, like this was just another interaction she could manage. One of them stepped forward, introduced himself calmly, identifying his affiliation with the harbor authority, and the shift in the air was immediate, not explosive, not loud, but unmistakable. Papers were presented, not waved around, not used as a threat, just handed over with a level of certainty that did not need emphasis. I stayed where I was, not stepping closer, not drawing attention, just watching as the conversation unfolded from a distance. Because this was not the moment to insert myself. This was the moment to let everything she had built meet something it was never designed to handle. At first, she responded the way she always did, explaining her position, referencing her authority, pointing to the notices, the signage, the structure she had put in place, her words flowing easily like she had rehearsed them enough times to believe them completely. But there was a difference now, something subtle in the way the responses came back to her. Not confrontational, not dismissive, just precise. Questions asked in a way that did not allow room for interpretation, requests for documentation that could not be answered with general statements. I could see it in her posture before it showed anywhere else. The slight shift in her stance, the way her shoulders tightened just enough to break the rhythm she had been carrying all week. Around us, the marina had gone almost completely quiet. Engines idling, but not moving. Conversations paused, everyone watching without making it obvious. Because even if they did not understand the details, they understood that something was happening that mattered. A few minutes later, more people arrived, not in a rush, just one after another, each one adding to the presence without raising the volume. And that was when it became clear that this was not a casual visit. This was a coordinated review. I could hear fragments of the conversation now, references to jurisdiction, to authorization, to recorded actions that extended beyond what had been declared, each piece connecting to something she had done over the past few days. For a brief moment, she tried to regain control, pointing toward the marina, referencing the community, insisting that everything was being handled appropriately, but the confidence in her voice had shifted, not gone, but strained, like it was being pushed against something it could not quite hold back anymore. I stayed exactly where I was, hands in my pockets, the familiar scent of salt and fuel in the air, the water moving gently against the docks like it always did, unchanged by any of this. And I realized that the moment had finally arrived, not with a confrontation, not with an argument, but with something much quieter and far more final. Because everything she had built was now being measured against something real, something structured, something that did not bend to confidence or assumption. And as the conversation continued, I could see it unfolding piece by piece. The system she created being pulled apart not by force, but by clarity. And the part she still had not realized yet, standing there trying to explain something that no longer made sense under scrutiny, was that this was only the beginning, because once the right people start asking the right questions, it does not stop with one answer. It keeps going until there is nothing left to explain. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved through the marina like a slow tide turning, subtle at first, almost easy to miss if you were not paying attention, but impossible to ignore once it reached a certain point. And I could see it in the way the conversation tightened around Linda, not louder, not more aggressive, just narrower, more focused, like every answer she gave was being guided into a place where it could be examined instead of accepted. The man from the harbor authority held one of her notices in his hand, the same clean print she had been using all week, and asked a question so simple it almost sounded casual, asking her to identify the specific jurisdictional authority under which she was issuing enforcement over the marina. For a brief second, she answered the way she always had, referencing community oversight, shared waterfront interests, the same phrases she had repeated enough times to make them sound legitimate. But this time, they did not land the same way. There was no pushback, no argument, just a pause, followed by another question, more precise, requesting documentation, something official, something that tied those statements to an actual recognized boundary. The silence that followed was not dramatic, but it carried weight, and I could feel it ripple outward, the people around us picking up on it even if they did not understand the details. I stepped a little closer then, not enough to interrupt, just enough to hear more clearly, the faint scent of salt and warmwood filling the air as the sun climbed higher and the marina lights shut off one by one. Papers changed hands again, this time from their side. Printed documents that outlined the exact boundary lines, the same ones I had studied the night before, the same ones that left no room for interpretation. And as they laid them out, pointing to specific coordinates, specific designations, I saw the moment everything shifted. It was not in her words, because she still tried to respond, still tried to hold on to the structure she had built, but it showed in the hesitation, the fraction of a second where confidence had to catch up with reality and could not quite get there in time. One of the representatives referenced the storage authorization next, the intake form I had picked up, her signature attached to a process that required authority she did not have. And again, the tone did not change. It remained steady, professional, but the direction was clear now. Around us, people had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations had faded completely, and the only sounds left were the soft movement of water and the occasional creak of rope against dock hardware. I could see Linda adjusting, trying to reposition the situation, suggesting that everything could be clarified, that there may have been a misunderstanding in how the boundaries were interpreted, and for a brief moment, it almost sounded like a way out, a way to step back without everything collapsing at once. That was the second false opening, the last chance for it to be framed as confusion instead of something more deliberate. But the response she received did not close the gap. It removed it entirely, because the documentation in front of her did not leave space for interpretation. It showed clearly that the marina had never been part of her jurisdiction, not in the past, not in any recent update, not in any form that could justify what had been done. The conversation continued, not escalating, not turning into anything loud or confrontational, just moving forward step by step, each question tying back to something she had enforced, each answer narrowing the explanation further until there was nothing left but the actions themselves. I stood there listening, the weight of everything settling into place in a way that felt almost quiet after all the build-up, and I realized that this was the part most people never see, not the moment of confrontation, but the moment where everything becomes clear enough that it cannot be undone. Because at this point, it was no longer about whether she believed she had authority, it was about the fact that she had acted on it, repeatedly, systematically, and now every one of those actions was sitting in front of people who knew exactly what it meant. And as the conversation reached that point, where explanation shifted into acknowledgement, even if it was not spoken directly, I understood that the outcome was no longer something that needed to be forced. It was already in motion, and all that was left was for it to carry through to its conclusion. The final resolution did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It came with a kind of administrative silence that felt heavier than anything that had happened before. And I remember standing at the edge of the dock that afternoon watching as the last of the documents were signed, stamped, and placed into folders that would decide what happened next, while the water kept moving the same way it always had, completely indifferent to the decisions being made above it. Linda Graves was no longer speaking with confidence at that point, not because anyone raised their voice, but because there was nothing left in the room that supported the version of authority she had been using all week. Every claim she had made, every notice she had issued, every enforcement action she had taken against the marina had been laid out in sequence, matched against jurisdictional records that had existed long before she ever arrived, and the gap between what she believed she controlled and what she actually controlled had become impossible to ignore. I stayed near the back of the dock office during the final review, not interfering, just observing as the Harbor Authority representative finished reading through the last confirmation, the one that clearly stated that all enforcement actions taken under her direction had occurred outside of designated jurisdiction and without legal standing. There was a moment after that where no one moved, not because there was uncertainty, but because there was nothing left to interpret. The system she had built had been measured against the actual framework it was supposed to exist within, and it did not fit. When the official notice of suspension of enforcement authority was finally handed to her, it was done without ceremony, no confrontation, no escalation, just a simple document placed on the table, and that was enough. I watched her read it once, then again, slower the second time, as if repetition might change the meaning, but it did not. Around us, the marina had returned to its natural rhythm, boats shifting slightly in their slips, ropes creaking in the wind, the faint sound of engines starting up again as people who had been waiting quietly began to move without hesitation for the first time in days. My boat was released shortly after, the paperwork processed in, a fraction of the time it had taken to detain it, and I walked with the recovery team down to the storage lot where it had been held, the same asphalt stretching under the afternoon sun, the same gate now standing open instead of controlled. When I stepped back aboard, I ran my hand along the rail, feeling the salt residue and heat that had built up over days of sitting still, And for the first time since this began, it felt like something had been returned not just physically, but structurally, as if the balance that had been disrupted was quietly resetting itself. Linda did not leave immediately. She stayed near the office for a while after everything was concluded, surrounded by people who were no longer taking instructions from her. And there was no dramatic exchange, no final confrontation, just distance where authority used to be. By the time I returned to the main dock, most of the temporary signage had already been removed, stacked neatly near the entrance. The laminated warnings that had dominated the space only days earlier now reduced to plastic sheets waiting to be discarded. The difference in atmosphere was immediate, not because anything was being celebrated, but because the pressure that had been holding everything in place was gone. People moved differently, spoke differently, as if they were remembering how the space was supposed to feel rather than adjusting to how it had been forced to operate. That evening, as the sun dropped lower and the light stretched across the water in long reflections, I stood alone for a while at the end of the pier, watching the marina return to something closer to its original state. And I thought about how easily systems like the one she built can take hold when no one checks where their boundaries actually are. What had started as a single act of overreach had turned into a fully documented sequence that could no longer be separated from consequence. And now it was no longer about winning or losing. It was about correction, slow and inevitable. My boat sat back in its slip again, secured, untouched, and the empty space that had been there before no longer felt like absence. It felt like closure. Behind me, the office lights dimmed one by one, and the last reflection I saw on the water was not tension or uncertainty, but stillness returning to a place that had finally been understood again for what it actually was.